Late August 1944. The observation post sat perched on the northern coast of France, field telescopes trained toward England across the grey expanse of the English Channel. Inside the command post of Flak Regiment 155, German technical officers hunched over a crumpled morning report that made no sense whatsoever. The numbers stared back at them with mathematical certainty, yet they violated every principle of ballistic probability taught at Luftwaffe technical schools across the Reich. 82% destroyed. The officer checking the calculations looked up from his slide rule, his expression caught between confusion and disbelief. "This cannot be accurate," he muttered, running the figures again. But the field observations confirmed it. Through their telescopes in the pre-dawn hours, they had watched V-1 flying bombs launch from their ramps, their distinctive pulse jet engines roaring as they climbed toward cruising altitude. They had watched them set course for London, flying straight and true, and then, over the coastal gun belt, they had watched them die. Not shot down by fighters making dangerous pursuit curves, not tangled in barrage balloon cables, but destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, shells exploding around the missiles with impossible accuracy. The V's second would be flying steadily, then suddenly they'd be surrounded by flak bursts, and moments later they'd be tumbling from the sky in flames. The shells were exploding too far away for direct hits 50, perhaps even 100 feet from the missiles, yet somehow they were still lethal. Oberstleutnant Max Wachtel, commander of Flak Regiment 155 and the entire V-1 offensive, received these reports with growing alarm. Something was fundamentally wrong. The British had changed something, but what? This mystery had begun 10 weeks earlier, on June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day. Adolf Hitler had promised retaliation for the Allied invasion of Normandy, and at 4:25 inches the morning, that promise arrived. The first V-1 flying bomb fell on London, striking Grove Road in the Bow District. The explosion destroyed a railway bridge and nearby homes. 6 people were killed outright, 30 more injured, and 200 made homeless in an instant. The weapon represented years of German engineering development. A pilotless aircraft powered by an Argus, as 109-014 pulse jet engine, carrying 850 kilograms of Amatol explosive at 640 kilometers per hour. It was the world's first operational cruise missile, and German high command believed it would bring Britain to its knees. The distinctive buzzing sound of its pulse jet had already earned it a new name among Londoners, the buzz bomb or doodle bug. But in German military documents, it bore a more ominous designation: Vergeltungswaffe 1 Vengeance Weapon 1. Major Walter Dornberger, head of the V-weapons program at the secret Peenemünde Research Center on the Baltic coast, had calculated that even with a conservative 25% success rate, the V-1 would deliver more explosive power to London than the entire Blitz of 1940-1941. And unlike the Blitz, this assault would cost Germany far less. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce a fraction of the cost of a manned bomber mission, with absolutely no risk to aircrew. The weapons could be mass-produced and launched day and night, a relentless mechanical assault that required no pilots, no training, no years of preparation. At the Peenemünde Army Research Center, German scientists had every reason for confidence. They had developed advanced rocket technology that would eventually produce the V-2. They had created operational jet aircraft, and now they had fielded the world's first cruise missile. Dr. Robert Lusser, the engineer who designed the V-1's control system, had performed careful calculations showing that Allied interception was nearly impossible. The mathematics were compelling. The flying bomb travelled at 640 kilometers per hour, roughly 400 miles per hour, at varying altitudes between 600 and 2,700 meters. British fighters would need speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour just to catch it, and even then, they would have to close within 200 meters to destroy it, risking their own destruction from the massive explosion. The faster the intercepting fighter, the less time they had to aim and fire before overshooting their target. As for anti-aircraft fire, the probability calculations were even more discouraging for the defenders. The V-1 was a small, fast-moving target. German ballistic scientists calculated that achieving a direct hit required less than 1 in 10,000 shells fired. This wasn't propaganda or wishful thinking, it was sound ballistic science based on decades of artillery experience. Conventional time-fused shells required an elaborate sequence of near-impossible accuracy, precise radar detection, accurate range calculation, manual fuse setting based on predicted intercept point, and perfect timing. A gunner had perhaps 30 seconds from initial detection to engagement. In that brief window, they had to determine the V-1's altitude, speed, and trajectory, calculate where it would be in the seconds it took for the shell to reach that altitude, manually set the fuse, load the shell, aim, and fire. Any error in any step meant a complete miss. The V-1's varying altitude made this even more difficult. The missiles flew unpredictable flight paths, sometimes at 600 meters, sometimes at 2,700, with constant small variations. Each change required recalculation. Each recalculation burned precious seconds. Oberstleutnant Wachtel knew these limitations intimately from both sides of anti-aircraft warfare. He had commanded AA batteries earlier in the war and understood exactly how difficult his opponent's task would be. The V-1 should have been nearly unstoppable. For the first days of the campaign, reality matched predictions. In early June, British defences destroyed perhaps 10 to 17% of incoming Vosnes second, frustrating for the Germans, but within acceptable parameters. Fighter interception, barrage balloons, and lucky AA shots accounted for losses they had anticipated. But then, something changed. By late June, the interception rate had climbed to 24%. Higher than predicted, certainly, but explainable through British adaptation. Perhaps they were concentrating their fastest fighters, improving their radar, training their pilots in new pursuit techniques. Then came July, and the statistics became inexplicable. German technical officers monitoring the campaign's effectiveness noticed British anti-aircraft guns claiming V-1 kills with impossibly low ammunition expenditure. The numbers didn't make sense. Observers stationed on the French coast reported something even stranger. Vosnes second, flying steadily toward England, would suddenly be surrounded by flak bursts, and then they would tumble from the sky, despite the explosions occurring far too distant for direct hits. By early August, the interception rate had reached 60%. By mid-August, 74%. And then came that extraordinary day in late August when coastal guns destroyed 82% of all Vosnes second crossing the English coast. Wachtel called emergency meetings. He suspected sabotage. Perhaps resistance workers were tampering with the missiles before launch. Emergency inspections found nothing wrong. Test firings over German-held territory showed completely normal performance. The problem manifested only against British defences. German observers filed report after report describing the same impossible phenomenon, shells exploding 50 to 100 feet from the Vosnes second, yet somehow still destroying them. Physics said this shouldn't work. Shrapnel dispersed in all directions, losing energy with distance. At 50 feet, fragments should be too dispersed and too slow to damage a reinforced steel airframe carrying nearly a ton of explosive. Yet the Vosnes second kept falling from the sky, torn apart by explosions that should have been harmless near misses. In the observation post that August morning, staring at the 82% figure, the German officers understood only one thing with certainty. The British had developed something revolutionary. Something their intelligence services had completely missed. Something that was systematically destroying Hitler's vengeance weapon with a precision that German physics said shouldn't exist. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they were witnessing technology so revolutionary it was protected at the same security level as the atomic bomb itself. What the German observers were witnessing, what their ballistic calculations said was impossible, what their intelligence networks had completely failed to detect, was a technology so revolutionary that the Allied powers protected it with the same level of secrecy as the Manhattan Project. It had a deliberately misleading name, the VT fuse, with VT officially standing for variable time. The name was chosen specifically to suggest a conventional time fuse with adjustable settings. Nothing more than an improved version of existing technology. In reality, VT stood for something the Germans had concluded was impossible to build, a proximity fuse. Each shell contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, a device that could survive being fired from a gun, detect when it was near a target, and detonate itself at the optimal moment for maximum lethality. It was a shell that, in the words of stunned German scientists who would examine them after the war, could think for itself. The technology wasn't even new to the war. The first combat use had occurred in January 1943, nearly 2 years before that August morning, when German observers watched 82% of their Von second fall from the sky. The USS Helena, operating in the Pacific, had shot down a Japanese dive bomber using shells equipped with proximity fuses, shells that exploded when they sensed they were near the aircraft, turning what would have been a clean miss into a devastating kill. By August 1944, this technology was being deployed specifically against the V-1 threat, and it was transforming near misses into certain kills at a rate that violated every principle of ballistic probability the Germans understood. The German intelligence failure was comprehensive and catastrophic. They had actually received early warning and dismissed it entirely. In November 1939, a mysterious document known as the Oslo Report had been delivered to the British Embassy in Norway. The anonymous author, later identified as German physicist Hans Ferdinand Mayer, had provided detailed intelligence on German weapons development. Buried within the report was a brief mention that the Allies were researching proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells. German scientists who reviewed the intelligence dismissed it as obvious disinformation. The technical challenges were simply too great. Such a device was theoretically conceivable, but practically impossible. Germany hadn't ignored the concept, they had actively tried to develop it. Over 30 different proximity fuse designs had been researched at various German laboratories and research centres throughout the war. Engineers at Rheinmetall, scientists at the Luftwaffe research establishments, physicists at university laboratories, all had attempted to solve the problem. Every single design had failed to reach operational status. Not one had proven reliable enough for mass production. The technical barriers seemed insurmountable. A proximity fuse would need to contain a miniature radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. That alone seemed nearly impossible with 1940s electronics technology. But even if you could miniaturize the components sufficiently, they would have to survive being fired from a gun experiencing acceleration forces of 20,000 times Earth's gravity in the first few milliseconds. German tests had shown that vacuum tubes, the heart of any radio circuit, shattered consistently at forces above 5,000 G. Then there was the spin problem. Artillery shells spin at up to 25,000 revolutions per minute to maintain stability in flight. Any electronic components would have to function while being subjected to these enormous centrifugal forces. The batteries presented another seemingly unsolvable puzzle. They would need to remain stable and inert during years of storage in ammunition depots, surviving temperature extremes from Arctic cold to desert heat, yet activate instantly and reliably the moment the shell was fired. And even if all these problems could be solved in a laboratory prototype, mass-producing such devices with sufficient quality control to ensure reliability seemed flatly impossible. German engineers calculated that even if they solved every technical challenge, manufacturing costs would make the devices economically impractical. Their conclusion was logical, based on sound engineering analysis. Proximity fuses might be theoretically possible, but they were at least a decade away from practical battlefield deployment, if they could be developed at all. This conclusion, this certainty that the technology was impossible, would blind them completely to the evidence accumulating before their eyes. The reality of how the Allied proximity fuse worked was both elegant and revolutionary. At its core was a miniature radio transmitter that broadcast a continuous signal while the shell was in flight. When the radio waves reflected off a large object, such as an aircraft or a V-1 flying bomb, the receiver detected the reflected signal. As the shell drew closer to the target, the reflected signal grew stronger. When the signal strength indicated the shell was approximately 20 to 30 feet from the target, a circuit triggered a thyrotron switch, which fired the detonator. The explosion occurred at the optimal distance for maximum lethality, close enough that the expanding sphere of shrapnel would tear through the target's structure, but not so close that the shell simply punched through without exploding. By August 1944, the British had reorganized their entire anti-aircraft defense system specifically to maximize the effectiveness of this technology against the V-1 threat. Guns that had been positioned on the North Downs, inland from London, were moved to the south coast. This wasn't just a tactical repositioning, it was a strategic security measure. Any proximity-fused shells that failed to detonate would fall into the English Channel rather than on British soil, preventing the Germans from recovering and analysing them. The gun batteries were equipped with American-made SCR-584 radar systems for automatic target tracking. These radars could lock onto an incoming V-1, calculate its trajectory with remarkable precision, and feed firing solutions directly to the guns. The system was nearly automated, radar detected, calculated, and aimed. Gunners simply had to load and fire. The shells themselves had been modified specifically for the V-1 threat. Standard proximity fuses were optimized for aircraft, which were larger and flew more predictably. The V-1, with its small cross-section and high speed, required fuses with increased sensitivity and faster reaction times. The component innovations that made this possible were extraordinary achievements in miniaturization. Sylvania Electric had developed ruggedized vacuum tubes based on hearing aid design's tiny tubes that had been reinforced to survive the massive G-forces of being fired from a gun. Western Electric had contributed advances in miniaturization that allowed complex radio circuits to fit inside a shell's nose cone. The battery system was perhaps the most ingenious element. Through clever electrochemical engineering, designers had created batteries that remained completely inert during storage but activated instantly when subjected to the acceleration of being fired. The setback forces of firing literally activated the battery, which then powered the electronics for the brief seconds the shell was in flight. Quality control was unprecedented for a mass-produced electronic device. Every proximity fuse underwent multiple testing stages. Random samples were actually fired in test guns to verify they could survive and function. Despite the complexity and the massive scale of production, rejection rates remained below 2%, a remarkable achievement that demonstrated American manufacturing capability at its peak. The transformation in effectiveness was dramatic and immediate. Before proximity fuses, British anti-aircraft guns fired an average of 2,500 heavy shells to destroy a single V-1. The ammunition expenditure was enormous, the success rate discouraging. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to an average of 100 shells per kill, a 25-fold improvement in efficiency. The coastal gun belt's interception rate told an even more dramatic story. In June 1944, when the V-1 campaign began, the guns managed to destroy approximately 17% of incoming missiles. By July, with proximity-fused ammunition becoming more widely available and techniques refined, the rate climbed to 40%. Early August saw 60% of V-2 destroyed. By late August, the average had reached 74%. And then came that extraordinary day when 82% of all V-2 crossing the English coast were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. This transformation had occurred in just 10 weeks. It wasn't achieved through improved courage, better training, or refined tactics. It was pure technological superiority at scale, American electronics defeating German engineering through mass production of a device the Germans had concluded was impossible to build. The Germans, watching their vengeance weapons fall from the sky in ever-increasing numbers, scrambled to understand what had changed. They knew something was different. They suspected revolutionary improvements to British radar or anti-aircraft systems. But they never imagined shells that could think for themselves, that could sense their proximity to a target and detonate at the optimal moment. That possibility remained outside their framework of what was technically achievable. And so they kept launching V-2 into a kill zone where American technology systematically destroyed Hitler's terror weapon with a precision that German physics said shouldn't exist. While German observers puzzled over impossible interception rates, and their scientists insisted proximity fuses couldn't exist, American factories were producing them at a scale that would have seemed like science fiction to German industrial planners. The numbers reveal an industrial mobilization so vast, so comprehensive, that it represented not just a technological advantage, but a complete mismatch in manufacturing capability. By the war's end, American factories would produce 22 million proximity fuses, 22 million miniature radio transceivers, each one capable of surviving forces that would crush a human body instantly, each one able to think for itself in the microseconds before detonation. At peak production, in 1944, American factories were turning out 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. That's 40,000 complex electronic devices, each containing miniature vacuum tubes, radio circuits, batteries, and detonation mechanisms, manufactured to tolerances that ensured better than 98% reliability. The workforce dedicated to proximity fuse production exceeded 80,000 Americans. The investment totaled over $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. Production was distributed across 110 compartmentalized factories scattered throughout the United States, each facility knowing only its specific component or assembly task, none understanding the complete picture. To put this in perspective, American monthly production of proximity fuses exceeded Germany's total production of V-1 missiles for the entire war. The industrial capacity mismatch wasn't just significant, it was absolute. The cost trajectory of proximity fuse production tells its own remarkable story about American industrial learning curves. In 1942, when the first proximity fuses entered production, each unit cost $732, expensive, even by wartime standards, for what was essentially a disposable device. But as production scaled and manufacturing processes were refined, costs plummeted. By 1943, the price had dropped to $200 per unit. By 1944, it was down to $35. By 1945, the cost had fallen to just $18 per fuse. That's a 97.5% cost reduction through manufacturing excellence and economies of scale. American industry had taken a revolutionary technology that initially cost more than many complete artillery shells and transformed it into something economically viable for mass deployment. German economic planners, had they known these figures, would have found them incomprehensible. The security surrounding production was extraordinary. The code name variable time was deliberately chosen to mislead. To anyone not cleared for the program, It suggested merely an improved conventional time fuse, perhaps one with adjustable settings or more precise timing mechanisms. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that would warrant the security measures surrounding its production. Workers at the 110 factories knew only their specific tasks. A worker soldering connections on a circuit board didn't know what the circuit did. Someone assembling nose cones didn't know what went inside them. The compartmentalization was absolute. Even the name on the assembly line paperwork, VT fuse, revealed nothing about the device's true function. This meant that tens of thousands of American workers labored in near complete ignorance of what they were building, knowing only that it was important for the war effort and classified at the highest levels. The human stories behind this industrial miracle reveal the stark contrast between democratic voluntary mobilization and totalitarian forced production. The Crosley Corporation's transformation exemplifies American industry's wartime adaptation. Before December 1941, Crosley was a successful consumer appliance manufacturer based in Cincinnati, Ohio. They made radios and refrigerators, products that filled American homes during the Depression and pre-war years. The company had built its reputation on reliable consumer electronics at affordable prices. When the proximity fuse program ramped up production in 1943, Crosley dedicated its entire manufacturing facility to fuse production. The transformation was total refrigerator assembly lines were retooled for electronics. Radio production expertise was redirected toward miniaturized military components. At peak production, Crosley employed 10,000 workers in proximity fuse manufacturing. The facility produced 16,000 fuses daily, working around the clock in multiple shifts. By war's end, Crosley had manufactured over 5 million proximity fuses, nearly a quarter of total American production. 5 million devices that would save ships in the Pacific, destroy German aircraft over Europe, and systematically eliminate Hitler's vengeance weapons over the English Channel. The workers didn't know any of this. They knew they were building something classified, something important, something that required precision and care. They worked overtime voluntarily, collected premium wages, and took pride in their contribution to the war effort, but they didn't know specifically what they were building or how it would be used. Only after VE Day, when the proximity fuse was finally declassified, did Crosley workers learn that their assembly line work had helped save London from Hitler's terror weapons. The revelation was profound. They had been part of one of the war's most important technological achievements without knowing it. Sylvania Electric's contribution was equally remarkable. The company's Ipswich, Massachusetts facility became the heart of proximity fuse vacuum tube production. Over 5,000 women worked 12-hour shifts, producing specialized miniaturized vacuum tubes. These weren't ordinary tubes. They were ruggedized components designed to survive being fired from a gun, reinforced versions of hearing aid tubes that had been redesigned for military service. At peak production, Sylvania's Ipswich facility manufactured 400,000 miniaturized tubes daily. These tubes represented 95% of all vacuum tubes used in proximity fuses. The company's entire vacuum tube research division had been dedicated to developing components that could survive 20,000 G-forces while remaining small enough to fit inside an artillery shell nose cone. The women working these production lines, many of them wives and daughters of men serving overseas, understood they were contributing to the war effort, but they didn't know the specifics. They underwent security clearances, signed non-disclosure agreements, and worked with materials marked classified, but the actual application remained mysterious. Like the Crosley workers, they discovered only after the war that their 12-hour shifts had helped save London, protect the Pacific Fleet, and turn the tide of the air war over Europe. They had been part of a technological revolution that German scientists would later assess had put America a full decade ahead in electronics and manufacturing capability. The broader industrial mobilization involved dozens of major American corporations. Western Electric, RCA, Raytheon all contributed expertise and manufacturing capacity. Research universities, particularly Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under Dr. Merle Tuvey's direction, coordinated the scientific industrial collaboration that made mass production possible. This was something totalitarian systems structurally couldn't replicate. Dr. Tuvey would later reflect that the proximity fuse's success came from systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, and production workers, all treated as essential equals in the effort. Democratic industrial organization proved superior to forced hierarchies. The contrast with German V-1 production was absolute and damning. Germany would produce approximately 25,000 volts, one-flying bombs over the entire course of the war. Of these, 9,521 would be launched from ground sites against England, with thousands more fired against Antwerp and other targets. Each V-1 represented significant resource investment materials, labour, and factory capacity that could have been used for fighter aircraft, tanks, or conventional artillery. The missiles were manufactured in underground factories, most notably the Mittelwerk facility inside the Konstein Mountain, where they shared production space with the V-2 rocket program. The labour force consisted primarily of concentration camp prisoners, thousands of whom died from the brutal working conditions, starvation, and mistreatment. This was forced labour in the most literal sense, enslaved people working under threat of death to build weapons that would kill civilians. The moral dimension of this production method cannot be separated from its practical failures. Forced labour is inherently inefficient. Workers with no stake in quality, no motivation beyond survival, no voluntary commitment to the task, produce inferior results. Sabotage was common. Quality control was a constant struggle. The resource drain was enormous. The V-1 program consumed materials and manufacturing capacity desperately needed elsewhere. Each V-1 required high-grade steel, precision instruments, and specialized components. The production facilities required security, maintenance, and staffing. The launch infrastructure demanded construction resources and defensive positions. All of this was being invested in a weapon system that, by August 1944, was achieving only a 26% success rate, and even successful Vone second that reached London were producing minimal strategic impact. The British government, while concerned about civilian morale, never seriously considered negotiating or altering strategy because of the V-1 campaign. Meanwhile, Germany desperately needed the resources being poured into the V-weapon program, fighter aircraft, to defend the Reich against the combined bomber offensive. Anti-tank weapons for the Eastern Front, where Soviet armour was pushing relentlessly westward, artillery ammunition for every front, fuel for existing aircraft that sat grounded for lack of petroleum. The contrast in industrial systems was stark. America mobilized voluntary workers who produced revolutionary technology at unprecedented scale with extraordinary quality. Germany enslaved prisoners to handcraft weapons in limited numbers with questionable reliability. America's system produced 22 million proximity fuses, while Germany produced 25,000 volts 1 second. American workers volunteered for overtime and earned premium wages. German production relied on human suffering and death. American quality control achieved rejection rates below 2%. German Vone second suffered mechanical failures at rates exceeding 10%. The quality control and testing regimen for proximity fuses was unprecedented for mass-produced electronics. Every single fuse underwent multiple testing stages before being approved for shipment. Visual inspections checked for manufacturing defects. Electrical testing verified circuit function. Component testing ensured each subsystem operated correctly. Random samples were subjected to the ultimate test. They were actually fired in test guns. Engineers would load sample fuses into artillery pieces and fire them at test targets to verify they survived firing and functioned correctly. This destructive testing was expensive and time-consuming, but it ensured that proximity fuses reaching combat units would perform reliably. The rejection rate remaining below 2%, despite this rigorous testing, demonstrated remarkable manufacturing precision at massive scale. This was mass production, achieving quality levels that exceeded most handcrafted German prototype weapons. German assumptions about mass production had proven entirely wrong. They had believed that high-quality precision devices could only be produced in small numbers through careful craftsmanship. The idea that you could mass-produce complex electronics with better than 98% reliability seemed impossible to them. Yet, American industry had done exactly that, producing 40,000 sophisticated electronic devices daily while maintaining quality standards that German precision manufacturing rarely achieved even in limited production runs. This represented not just technological superiority, but a fundamental advantage in industrial organization, quality control methodology, and manufacturing philosophy. America had proven that democratic capitalism could outproduce, out-innovate, and out-manufacture totalitarian forced labor systems by an almost incomprehensible margin. The proximity fuse production statistics weren't just numbers, they were evidence of a civilizational level advantage that Germany never recognized until after defeat. As V-1 interception rates climbed beyond all reasonable explanation, Oberstleutnant Max Wachtel faced a crisis that defied logical solution. His weapons were being destroyed at rates that violated the fundamental physics of anti-aircraft warfare. He knew the British had changed something. The statistics proved it conclusively. But what had they changed? And more importantly, how could Germany counter it? Wachtel's initial suspicion fell on sabotage. Perhaps resistance fighters were tampering with the missiles before launch. Perhaps sympathetic workers at the manufacturing facilities were introducing subtle defects that wouldn't manifest until the Vosnes second encountered British defences. It seemed far-fetched, but it was more plausible than British gunners suddenly achieving accuracy rates that German ballistic science said were impossible. Emergency inspections found nothing. The Vosnes second were manufactured correctly, fueled properly, armed correctly. Pre-launch checks revealed no defects. Test firings over German-held territory showed completely normal performance. The missiles flew straight, maintained proper altitude, and would have reached their targets had any existed within range. The problem manifested exclusively when Vosnes second encountered British coastal defences. Something about the British gun belt was different, revolutionary, and utterly mysterious. German technical officers developed theories. Perhaps the British had achieved breakthroughs in radar technology, allowing faster and more accurate targeting. This was partially correct. The SCR-584 radar was indeed more capable than German systems, but it didn't explain the lethality of near misses. Perhaps British gunners had developed faster mechanical fuse setting mechanisms, allowing them to fire more shells more quickly with better timing. This theory seemed plausible, but failed to explain observer reports of shells exploding far from their targets, yet still destroying Vosnes second. Never once did German analysts seriously consider that the shells themselves might be intelligent, might be able to sense proximity to targets, and detonate themselves at the optimal moment. That possibility remained outside the framework of what German science considered achievable. So Wachtel tried everything else he could imagine. Altitude variations, high-level launches at 2,700 meters to stress British radar tracking, then low-level runs at 600 meters to reduce detection time. The Vosnes second fell from the sky at both altitudes with equal efficiency. Timing shifts. Night launches to eliminate visual tracking and complicate radar operations. The darkness made no difference. If anything, night interception rates were sometimes higher because gun crews could see the V-1's distinctive exhaust flame and didn't need to rely on visual observation. Salvo tactics. Launching multiple Vone second simultaneously to overwhelm defences, forcing British gunners to divide their attention and fire. The British simply engaged each missile in turn, systematically destroying them one after another. Weather exploitation. Launching during storms, fog, and heavy cloud cover to interfere with radar and visual observation. The proximity fuses worked equally well, regardless of visibility. They didn't need to see the V-1, only sense its electromagnetic presence. Speed variations. Engine modifications attempting to increase velocity, making interception even more difficult. The faster Vone second died just as efficiently as standard models. Flight path randomization, programming irregular courses and altitude changes to complicate targeting calculations. The automated SCR-584 radar adjusted instantly to track changes, feeding corrected firing solutions to guns faster than any human calculator could manage. Nothing worked. Every tactical variation, every technical modification, every operational change failed to reduce the devastating kill rate. By late August, Wachtel was facing the uncomfortable reality that the British possessed a capability Germany couldn't understand, couldn't counter, and couldn't replicate. At Peenemünde, scientists faced an even more uncomfortable conclusion. If the Allies had developed proximity fuses, the only technology that could explain the observed effects, then they had achieved what Germany's best engineers had proven impossible. The implications were devastating. If the Americans and British were that far ahead in electronics and miniaturization, what other technological surprises might they possess? The ultimate irony of German blindness came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final major offensive in the West achieved initial tactical surprise, and German armoured spearheads captured numerous American positions in the Ardennes forest. Among the captured positions were ammunition dumps containing artillery shells of various types, standard, high-explosive, armour-piercing, white phosphorus smoke, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. The Germans now possessed actual VT fuses in their hands, physical evidence of the technology that had been systematically destroying their Vone second for months. Proximity fuses sitting in ammunition crates, marked with standard American military nomenclature, ready for examination. They never recognized them. German soldiers and officers examining the captured ammunition saw artillery shells marked with various codes and designations. They saw VT and understood it according to their preconceptions, variable time, an improved conventional time fuse, nothing revolutionary. Some shells were set aside for shipment to technical intelligence units for analysis. Others were simply captured war material, documented but not immediately examined. The cognitive blindness was complete. Because German scientists had concluded that proximity fuses were impossible to manufacture, German intelligence officers weren't looking for them. When they physically possessed examples of the very technology that had been defeating their weapons for months, their assumption that such devices cannot exist prevented them from recognizing what they held. This represents perhaps the greatest single intelligence failure of World War II. The weapon system that had neutralized Germany's most sophisticated terror weapon, the technology that would later prove decisive in protecting the Pacific Fleet, the device that represented a decade-long American advantage in electronics, all of this was sitting in captured ammunition dumps, and the Germans never realized what they had. Some captured proximity fuses were eventually sent to technical analysis facilities, but even there, preconceptions prevented recognition. Analysts examining the shells looked for improvements in mechanical timing mechanisms, better quality fuses, perhaps more reliable detonators. They didn't disassemble and analyze them as potentially revolutionary electronic devices because their scientific framework had already determined that such devices couldn't exist in practical form. The Battle of the Bulge capture represented Germany's last opportunity to understand what was defeating them. By the time the offensive stalled and American forces recaptured the territory, any proximity fuses that might have been shipped deeper into Germany for analysis were lost in the chaos of retreat, or sat unexamined in warehouses, while German forces collapsed on all fronts. The ultimate lesson: assumption can blind you to evidence in your own hands. If your scientific community has concluded something is impossible, you may fail to recognize it even when confronted with physical proof. The Allied security triumph was extraordinary in its completeness. Despite the massive scale of proximity, fuse deployment against V-1 seconded thousands of shells fired daily for months. Not a single intact proximity fuse fell into German hands during the entire V-1 campaign. The British coastal gun positioning was critical to this success. By moving anti-aircraft batteries from the North Downs to the south coast, the British ensured that any proximity fused shell that failed to detonate would fall into the English Channel rather than on land. The moment shells left the guns, they were over water. Any duds would sink into the channel where German recovery was impossible. Royal Navy patrol vessels actively monitored the waters off the coast, ready to prevent any German attempt at salvage operations. The British were taking no chances. If a German boat attempted to recover unexploded shells, it would be intercepted and sunk. For the rare proximity-fused shells fired inland during the period when guns were still positioned on the North Downs, immediate recovery teams were dispatched for any reported duds. These teams had priority authorization and would arrive within hours, sometimes minutes, to secure any unexploded ordnance. The shells were collected, documented, and immediately transported to secure facilities. British anti-aircraft crews themselves didn't know what made their special ammunition so effective. They received shells marked with specific codes indicating VT fuses, along with strict handling instructions and accounting requirements. Every single VT fused shell fired had to be documented, serial numbers recorded, expenditure logged, any recovered duds immediately reported through secure channels. The crews knew they had special ammunition with classification restrictions. They knew it was more effective than standard shells. They knew the accounting was unusually strict, but they didn't know how the shells worked or what made them special. This compartmentalization meant that even if German intelligence had captured and interrogated British gunners, those gunners could have revealed nothing about proximity fuse technology because they knew nothing beyond the special shells work better. The cost of this security was measured in Allied lives. Ground forces fighting in France, Belgium, and Germany could have used proximity-fused artillery against German aircraft and tactical targets. The technology would have been devastating against low-flying ground attack aircraft and could have saved thousands of soldiers' lives. But the risk of a single proximity fuse being captured and analysed was deemed too great. The technology remained restricted to overwater use, where recovery by the enemy was nearly impossible. Only in December 1944, after the Battle of the Bulge had already begun, and with the war's outcome no longer in doubt, were proximity fuses authorized for ground use, and even then, only in areas where Allied forces could quickly recover any duds. German intelligence networks, despite their extensive reach and technical expertise, failed completely to penetrate the proximity fuse program. Germany maintained spy networks in Britain, technical intelligence gathering operations, signal intelligence capabilities, and aerial reconnaissance assets. None of them detected the proximity fuse's existence or function. Agents in Britain found nothing because the compartmentalization was absolute and British security services were vigilant. Technical intelligence gathering from the continent could observe British gun emplacements and radar installations but couldn't determine what made the shells effective. Signal intelligence could detect British radar transmissions, but not the miniature radio transmissions from individual shells. Aerial reconnaissance photographed gun positions, but couldn't reveal the electronics inside artillery shells. The Oslo report's early warning in November 1943 had been dismissed and forgotten. When evidence began accumulating in 1944 that something revolutionary was destroying Vone 2nd, no one thought to revisit that early intelligence and reconsider whether the proximity fuse research mentioned there had actually succeeded. Post-war assessment would conclude this was one of history's greatest intelligence disasters, a complete failure to detect a technology that fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Despite years of operation and massive deployment, after Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence officers began systematic interrogations of German military personnel and weapons scientists. Among those questioned was Oberstleutnant Max Wachtel, the commander who had watched his V-1 offensive systematically dismantled by technology he couldn't understand. Wachtel's testimony revealed the complete German blindness. "We suspected the British had developed improved radar systems," he told his interrogators. "Perhaps faster mechanical fuse setting mechanisms that allowed more rapid engagement. We considered many possibilities." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to admit. "We never imagined shells that could think for themselves. Such a thing seemed beyond the possible." When Allied officers showed him captured German intelligence assessments from August 1944, Wachtel could only shake his head. The reports had speculated about every possible British advantage except the actual one. Better radar, yes, they'd considered that. Improved fighter tactics, certainly. Faster gun crews possible. But proximity fuses? That technology remained in the realm of theoretical impossibility, according to German scientific consensus. The revelation of what had actually defeated his weapons appeared to genuinely shock him. The Americans had mass-produced miniature radio transceivers that could survive being fired from guns, detect targets, and detonate themselves at optimal range. Not prototype devices in limited numbers, but millions of them, produced for less than $20 each by war's end. German weapons scientists shown captured American VT fuses reacted with even more profound disbelief. Dr. Herbert Wagner, who had worked on German proximity fuse research, examined an American fuse with something approaching awe. "This shouldn't be possible," he said, turning the device over in his hands. The vacuum tubes alone, they would need to survive 20,000 G-forces. Our tests showed tubes shattering at 5,000. When Allied technical officers demonstrated a disassembled proximity fuse, explaining each component and its function, German scientists gathered around like students before a master's lecture. The miniaturized vacuum tubes, based on hearing aid designs, but reinforced for artillery use. The battery system that remained dormant for years, yet activated instantly on firing. The radio circuit small enough to fit in a shell nose cone, yet robust enough to function after the violence of being fired from a gun. The thyrotron switch that triggered detonation at precisely the optimal moment. Each element represented engineering challenges. German researchers had concluded were insurmountable. Individually, each component seemed nearly impossible. Together, in a mass-produced device costing $18, they represented a technological capability Germany hadn't imagined America possessed. "We estimated we were perhaps 3 to 5 years behind American electronics capability," one German scientist admitted during interrogation. "Now, seeing this," he gestured at the disassembled proximity fuse, 10 years would be optimistic, perhaps more. This represents not just advanced engineering, but an entire industrial philosophy we don't possess." Dr. Merle Tuve, who had led the proximity fuse development program at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, was invited to a post-war technical conference where German and Allied scientists discussed wartime developments. His assessment of why America had succeeded where Germany failed was diplomatic but pointed. The proximity fuse succeeded because we achieved systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, and production workers, Tuve explained. Everyone involved, from the physicist calculating radio frequencies to the factory worker soldering connections, was treated as essential to success. Ideas flowed in all directions. A production line worker could suggest improvements that scientists would seriously consider. This kind of collaboration is very difficult to achieve in hierarchical, authoritarian systems. The implication was clear, though Tuve was too polite to state it directly. Democratic industrial organization had proven superior to totalitarian forced labor systems. American voluntary cooperation had outperformed German rigid hierarchy. The final accounting of the V-1 campaign revealed both the tragedy and the triumph of the proximity fuse deployment. From June 1944 through March 1945, Germany launched 9,521 volts, flying bombs from ground sites against Britain. Additional thousands were launched against Antwerp and other targets after Allied forces overran the French launch sites, bringing total V-1 production to approximately 25,000 missiles. Of the 9,521 launched at Britain, only 2,515 reached London, a success rate of just 26.4%. The remaining 7,000 plus were destroyed by British defences or failed mechanically in flight. Coastal gun batteries equipped with proximity fuses accounted for approximately 4,000 kills. Fighter aircraft destroyed roughly 1,900. Barrage balloons claimed about 200. Mechanical failures and crashes accounted for the remainder. The human cost in London was tragic, but far less than German planners had intended. 6,184 British civilians were killed by V-1 impacts, with 17,981 injured and tens of thousands made homeless. Each death was a tragedy, each injury a permanent scar. But these numbers represented a fraction of what the V-1 campaign was designed to achieve. General Frederick Pyle, who commanded Britain's anti-aircraft command, conducted a post-war analysis that reached a sobering conclusion. Without proximity fuses, V-1 casualties would have been 4 to 5 times higher. Instead of 6,184 killed, Britain would have suffered 25,000 to 30,000 dead. Instead of 17,981 injured, perhaps 75,000 to 90,000 wounded. The proximity fuse had literally saved London. Those 22 million American-produced fuses, those 80,000 workers, that $1 billion investment, it had prevented a humanitarian catastrophe in the final year of the European War. For Germany, the V-1 program represented a catastrophic misallocation of resources. The millions of Reichsmarks invested, the slave labour employed, the manufacturing capacity dedicated, all of it produced minimal strategic impact while draining resources desperately needed elsewhere. Those resources could have produced additional Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters to defend the Reich against the combined bomber offensive. They could have manufactured Panther tanks for the Eastern Front, where Soviet armour was inexorably pushing toward Berlin. They could have produced conventional artillery ammunition, which was in chronically short supply across all fronts by late 1944. Instead, they built 25,000 flying bombs that were systematically destroyed by technology. German science had concluded couldn't exist. Weapons built through the suffering and death of concentration camp prisoners, achieving nothing except to demonstrate the futility of wonder weapons against superior industrial capacity. In September 1945, 5 months after Germany's surrender and 1 month after Japan's, the US War Department finally declassified the proximity fuse. The announcement began with a statement that, in retrospect, seems almost understated. one of the most important weapons developed during the war, surpassed in effectiveness only by the atomic bomb. The American public, which had followed the war's progress through newspapers and newsreels, suddenly learned about a secret weapons program that had been protected with the same security measures as the Manhattan Project. Workers at Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati discovered that the mysterious devices they'd been producing had saved London from Hitler's terror weapons. The 5,000 women at Sylvania's Ipswich facility learned that their 12-hour shifts producing miniaturized vacuum tubes had protected the Pacific Fleet and turned the tide of the air war over Europe. British anti-aircraft crews finally understood why their special ammunition had been so devastatingly effective. The strict accounting requirements, the security restrictions, the classified markings, it all made sense now. They had been firing shells that could think for themselves, artillery rounds containing more electronics than many entire buildings had possessed before the war. For German scientists and military officers learning about the declassification, the revelation brought a mixture of understanding and humiliation. They had spent months developing theories to explain impossible interception rates, never imagining the actual answer. They had captured proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge and failed to recognize them. They had been defeated not by superior strategy or courage, but by industrial capacity they hadn't imagined possible. Former Peenemünde scientists, reading technical descriptions of American proximity fuses in declassified reports, understood they had been fighting a war they couldn't win. They had believed their V-1 represented the pinnacle of weapons technology. Learning it was defeated by mass-produced electronics, costing less than $20 each, was devastating. They had lost not to warriors but to assembly lines, not to genius but to democratic industrial organization, operating at a scale totalitarian systems couldn't match. The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The technology evolved into modern air defense systems still in use today. The principles of radio proximity detection became fundamental to radar altimeters, allowing aircraft to measure altitude precisely. The miniaturization techniques developed for vacuum tubes accelerated the development of transistors and eventually integrated circuits. The quality control methodologies pioneered in proximity fuse production influenced post-war American manufacturing across all industries. But perhaps the most important legacy was what the proximity fuse proved about modern warfare itself. It demonstrated that victory in industrial-age conflicts is determined not just on battlefields, but in laboratories and factories. That mass-producing effective technology matters more than perfecting individual wonder weapons. That democratic systems capable of voluntary cooperation and systematic collaboration possess inherent advantages over authoritarian hierarchies built on forced labor and rigid control. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, had stated it clearly in 1945. The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The same technology that saved London saved the Pacific Fleet. The same industrial mobilization that produced 22 million fuses demonstrated America's capacity to outproduce any opponent. The same democratic organization that enabled collaboration between scientists, engineers, and workers proved superior to totalitarian forced brilliance. For Germany's former weapons scientists, the proximity fuse remained a permanent reminder of their wartime blindness, not just technological blindness, but blindness to the fundamental advantages of free societies in industrial competition. Return now to that extraordinary morning in late August 1944. German observers stand at their posts on the French coast, field telescopes trained on the pre-dawn sky. They watch V-1 flying bombs launch from their ramps, pulse jet engines roaring, climbing to cruising altitude with mechanical precision. The weapons fly steadily toward England, exactly as designed, following the flight paths Dr. Robert Lusser's calculations said would make them nearly impossible to intercept. Then, over the English coastal gun belt, the V-2 enter the kill zone. Suddenly, they're surrounded by flak bursts, explosions occurring 50, 70, 100 feet away, distances that shouldn't matter, that German ballistic science said were too far to cause damage. Yet the missiles tumble from the sky anyway, burning, breaking apart, falling into the channel in pieces. 82% destroyed in a single day. The German observers don't understand what they're witnessing. They can't understand. The technology defeating their weapons exists outside their framework of the possible. They've done everything right, developed advanced weapons, trained elite crews, achieved genuine engineering breakthroughs. Yet they're being defeated by something invisible, something their best scientists insist cannot exist. They never discover the truth until long after it matters. Never learn about the 22 million proximity fuses, the 80,000 American workers, the women at Sylvania working 12-hour shifts, producing components they didn't know would save London. Never understand that they lost the war in factories before they lost it on battlefields, defeated by industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian engineering. By millions of small explosions, guided by technology, German science deemed impossible. The V-2 fall burning from the sky, and the Germans watching never know why.